One thing you have to say about a fat bastard taunt. It always gets him going. And then he straightened, and I could see his boot so near to my face I saw the spider cracks in the leather, and still trying to shake off the pain, I lifted one pathetic hand as though to ward off the inevitable kick. The kick, though, when it came, was aimed not at my face, but squarely at my belly, and was so hard that it lifted me into the air, and I was deposited back on the deck. From the corner of my eye I saw Thatch, and perhaps I'd allowed myself to believe that he favoured me in the bout. But he was laughing just as heartily at my misfortune as he had been when Blaney was rocked. I rolled weakly to my side as I saw Blaney coming towards me. He lifted his boot to stamp on me and looked up to Thatch. "Sir?" he asked. To hell with that. I wasn't waiting. With a grunt, I grabbed his foot, twisted it, and sent him sprawling back to the deck. A tremor of renewed interest ran through the spectators. Whistles and shouts, cheers and boos. They didn't care who won. They just wanted the spectacle. But now Blaney was down, and with a fresh surge of strength, I threw myself on top of him, pummeling him with my fists, at the same time as I drove my knees into his groin and midriff, attacking him like a child in the throes of a temper tantrum, hoping against hope that I might lay him out with a lucky blow. I didn't. There were no lucky blows today. Just Blaney grabbing my fists, wrenching me to the side, slamming the flat of his hand into my face, and sending me flying backwards. I heard my nose break and felt blood gush over my top lip. Blaney lumbered over, and this time he wasn't waiting for Thatcher's permission. This time he was coming in for the kill. In his fist shone a blade. There was the crack of a pistol, and a hole appeared on his forehead. His mouth dropped open, and the fat bastard fell to his knees, dead to the deck. When my vision cleared, I saw Thatch reaching to help me from the deck with one hand. In the other, a flintlock pistol, still warm. "I got a vacancy on my crew, lad," he said. "Do you want to fill it?" I nodded as I stood and looked down at Blaney's body. A wisp of smoke rose from the bloody hole in his forehead. Should have killed me when you had the chance, I thought. 21. March 1713. Miles away, in a place I'd never visited and never would, although after all it's never too late, a bunch of representatives of England, Spain, France, Portugal and Holland were sitting down to draft a series of treaties that would end up changing all our lives, forcing us to take a new direction, shattering our dreams. But that was to come. First, I found myself adjusting to a new life, a life I liked very much. I was lucky, I suppose, because Edward Thatch took to me. A scrapper was what he called me, and I think he liked having me around. He used to say that in me he had a trusted hand, and he was right, he did, for Edward Thatch had saved me from embarking on a life of crime under Captain Dezel. Well, either that or be thrown overboard like those other poor fellows. It was thanks to his intervention, and thanks to being taken under his wing, that I could make something of myself, return to Bristol and to Caroline as a man of quality, head held high. And yes, just because you and I know that it didn't work out that way doesn't make it any less true. Life at sea was very much the same as it had been before, but with certain attractive differences. There was no Blaney, of course. The last I'd seen of that particular barnacle on my life was him slipping into the sea like a dead whale. And there was no Captain Alexander Dezel. He ended up being condemned to death by the British in 1715. Without those two, life on ship immediately improved. It was the life of a privateer. And so we engaged the Spanish and Portuguese when we could, and took prizes when we could, and along with the skills of a sailor I began to refine the craft of combat. Thatch took me under his wing. From him I learnt better sword skills, and I learnt how to use pistols. And also from Edward Thatch, I learnt a certain philosophy of life, a philosophy that he in turn had learnt from another older buccaneer, a man under whom Edward served, who would also be my mentor, a man named Benjamin Hornigold. And where else should I meet Benjamin but at Nassau? I'm not sure we ever thought of the port of Nassau on New Providence Island as ever really belonging to us, because that wasn't our way. But it was a kind of heaven for us, with its steep cliffs on one side, its long sloping beach that swept down to a shallow sea, too shallow for His Majesty's men of war, its quayside where we offloaded booty and supplies, and its hillside fortress on the hill, overlooking a raggle-taggle collection of shanty houses, huts, and crumbling wooden terraces. And, of course, it had a wonderful harbour, where vessels enjoyed shelter from the elements and from our enemies. Making an attack even more difficult was the ship's graveyard, where the skeletal remains of burnt and grounded ships were a warning to the unwary. There were the palms, the smell of seawater and tar in the air, taverns, and plentiful rum. And Edward Thatch was there, and Benjamin Hornigold was there. I liked Benjamin. He'd been Blackbeard's mentor just as Blackbeard was mine, and there was never a better sailor than Benjamin Hornigold. And yet, although you may think I'm only saying this because of what subsequently happened, you're going to have to believe me when I swear it's true. I always thought there was something apart about him. Not only did he have a more military bearing and a hawk nose like a tough English general, but he dressed differently as well, more like a soldier than a buccaneer. But still, I liked him, and if I didn't like him as much as I liked Edward, well, then I respected him as much, if not more. After all, Benjamin was the one who had helped establish Nassau in the first place. For that, if nothing else, I liked him. I was sailing with Edward in July 1713 when the quartermaster was killed on a trip ashore. 2 weeks after that we received a message, and I was called to the captain's quarters. "Can you read, son?" "Yes, sir," I said, and I thought briefly of my wife back home. Edward sat at one side of his navigation table rather than behind it. His legs were crossed, and he wore long black boots, a red sash at his waist, and 4 pistols in a thick leather shoulder belt. Maps and charts were laid out beside him, but something told me it wasn't those he needed reading. "I need a new quartermaster," he said. "Oh, sir, I don't think—" He roared with laughter and slapped his thighs. "No, son, I don't think either. You're too young, and you don't have the experience to be a quartermaster. Isn't that right?" I looked at my boots. "Come here," he said. "Read this." I did as I was asked, reading aloud a short communication with news of a treaty between the English, the Spanish, Portuguese. "Does it mean—" I said, when I'd finished. "Indeed it does, Edward," he said. And it was the first time he'd ever called me by my name rather than son or lad. In fact, I don't think he ever called me son or lad again. "It means your Captain Alexander Dazelle was right, and that the days of privateers filling their boots are over. I'll be making an announcement to the crew later. Will you follow me yourself?" I would have followed him to the ends of the earth, but I didn't say so. Just nodded as though I had a lot of options. He looked at me. All that black hair and beard lent his eyes an extra penetrating shine. "You will be a pirate, Edward. A wanted man. Are you sure you want that?" To tell you the truth, I wasn't. But what choice did I have? I couldn't go back to Bristol. I didn't dare go back without a pot of money, and the only way of making money was to become a pirate. "We shall set sail for Nassau," said Thatch. "We pledge to meet Benjamin, should this ever happen. I dare say we shall join forces, for we'll both lose crew in the wake of this announcement." I'd like you by my side, Edward. You've got courage and heart and skill in battle, and I can always use a man with letters. I nodded, flattered. When I went back to my hammock, though, and was alone, I closed my eyes for fear that tears might squeeze out. I had not come to sea to be a pirate. Oh, of course I saw I had no other choice but to follow that path. Others were doing it, including Edward Thatch. But even so, it was not what I had wanted for myself. I'd never wanted to be an outlaw. Like I say, though, I didn't feel I had much choice. And from that moment on, I abandoned any plans I had of returning to Bristol as a man of quality. The best I could hope for was to return to Bristol as a man of means. From that moment on, my quest became one of acquiring riches. From that moment on, I was a pirate. Part 2. 22. June 1715. There is nothing quite so loud as the sound of a carriage gun blast, especially when it goes off in your ear. It's like being pummeled by nothing, a nothing that seems to want to crush you. And you're not sure whether it's a trick of your eyesight, shocked and dazzled by the blast, or whether the world really is shaking. Probably it doesn't even matter. Somewhere the shot impacts. Boat planks splinter, men with their arms and legs torn off, and men who look down and in the few seconds they have before dying realise half their body has been shot away, begin shrieking. All you hear in the immediate aftermath is the shrieking of the damaged hull, the screams of the dead and dying. I wouldn't say you ever get used to it, the blast of a carriage gun, the way it tears a hole in your world. But the trick is to recover swiftly. The trick is to recover from it more swiftly than your enemy. That's how you stay alive. We'd been off the coast of Cape Buena Vista in Cuba when the English had attacked. We called them the English upon the brigantine, even though English made up the core of our crew, and I myself was English by birth, English in my heart. But it counted for nothing as a pirate. You were an enemy of His Majesty. Queen Anne had been succeeded by King George, an enemy of the Crown, which made you an enemy of His Majesty's Navy. And so when, sail ho, we saw the red ensign on the horizon, the sight of a frigate foaming across the ocean towards us, and the figures running to and fro on her decks, what we said was, "The English are attacking! The English are attacking!" with no regard for the small details of our actual nationalities. And this one, she came at us fast. We were trying to turn and put distance between us and her 6-pounders, but she bore down upon us, slicing across our bows, so close we could see the whites of the crew's eyes, the flash of their gold teeth, the glint of sun on the steel in their hands. Flame bloomed along her sides as her carriage guns thundered. Steel tore the air. Our hull shrieked and cracked as the shots found their mark. The day had been full of rain. The powder smoke turned it into a night full of rain. It filled our lungs and made us cough, choke and splutter, throwing us into even more disarray and panic. And then that feeling of the world crashing in, that shock, and those moments of wondering if you'd been hit and if maybe you were dead, and perhaps this was what it felt like in heaven, or most likely, in my case at least, in hell. Which of course it must do, because hell is smoke and fire and pain and screaming, so in actual fact whether you were dead or not it made no difference. Either way you were in hell. At the first crash bang I'd raised my arms to protect myself. Luckily, I felt shards of splintered wood that would otherwise have punctured my face and eyes embed themselves into my arm, and the force was enough to send me staggering back, tripping and falling. They'd used bar shot. Big iron bars that would blast a hole in virtually anything provided they were close enough. In this case they'd done their job. The English had no interest in boarding us. As pirates we would inflict as little damage upon our target as possible. Our aim was to board and to loot over a period of days if needs be. It was difficult to loot a sinking ship, but the English, or this particular command at least, either knew we had no treasure aboard or didn't care. They simply wanted to destroy us, and they were doing a bloody good job of it. I dragged myself to my feet, felt something warm running down my arm, and looked to see blood from a splinter blob to the planks of the deck. With a grimace, I reached to tear the wood from my arm and tossed it to the deck, barely registering the pain as I squinted through a fog of powder smoke and lashing rain. A cheer went up from the crew of the English frigate as she churned past our starboard side. There was the pop and fizz of musket and flintlock pistol shot. Stink pots and grenados came sailing over, exploding on deck and adding to the chaos, the damage and the choking smoke that hung over us like a death shroud. The stink pots in particular let out a vicious sulphur gas that sent men to their knees, making the air so dense and black that it became difficult to see, to judge distance. Even so, I saw him, the hooded figure who stood on their forecastle deck. His arms were folded, and he stood still in his robes, his entire demeanour emanating unconcern at the events that were unfolding around him. This I could tell from his posture and his eyes that gleamed from beneath the cowl of his robes. Eyes that for a second were fixed on me. And then our attackers were swallowed up by smoke. A ghost ship amid a fog of powder belch, sizzling rain and choking stink-pot fumes. All around me was the sound of shattering wood and screaming men. The dead were everywhere, littering torn planks awash with their blood. Through a gash in the main deck I saw water on the decks below, and from above heard the complaint of wood and the tearing of the smoky shroud, and looked up to see our mainsail half destroyed by chain shot. A dead lookout with most of his head shorn away hung by his feet from the crow's nest, and men were already scaling the ratlines to try to cut the broken mast free, but they were too late. She was already listing, wallowing in the water like a fat woman taking a bath. At last enough of the smoke cleared to see that the British frigate was coming round in order to use its starboard guns. But now she ran into a spot of bad luck. Before the ship could be brought to bear, the same wind that had dispersed the smoke dropped, and her plump sails flattened and she slowed. We'd been given our second chance. "Man the guns!" I shouted. Those members of our crew still on their feet were scrambling to the mounted guns. I manned the swivel gun, and we delivered a broadside that the attacking frigate could do nothing about, our shot inflicting almost as much damage to them as they had to us. And now it was our turn to cheer. Defeat had turned, if not quite to victory, then at least to a lucky escape. Perhaps there were those of us who were even wondering what treasures might be on board the British vessel, and I saw one or two of our men, the optimistic few, with boarding hooks, axes and marlinspikes, ready to lash the ship close and take them on man. But any plans were dashed by what happened next. "The magazine!" came the cry. "She's going up!" The news was followed by screams, and as I looked from my post at the swivel gun towards the bow, I saw flames around the breach in the hull. Meanwhile, from the stern came the cries of our captain, Captain Brahma, while on the poop deck of the ship opposite, the man in the robes leapt into action. Literally. He unfolded his arms and in one short jump was on the rail of the deck, then in the next instant had jumped across to our ship. For a moment the impression I had of him in the air was like an eagle, his robes spread out behind him, his arms outstretched like wings. Next I saw Captain Brahma fall. Crouched over him, the hooded man's arm pulled back, and a hidden blade sprang from within his sleeve. That blade! I was transfixed by it for a second. The flames from the burning deck made it alive, and then the hooded man drove it deep into Captain Brahma. I stood and stared, my own cutlass in my hand. From behind I vaguely heard the cries of the crew as they tried in vain to stop the fire spreading to the magazine. It will go up, I thought distractedly. The magazine will explode, thinking of the barrels of gunpowder stored there. The English ship close enough so that the explosion would surely blast a hole in the hull of both ships. All of this I knew, but only as distant, distracted thoughts. I was spellbound by the hooded man at work, mesmerized by this agent of death, who had ignored the carnage around him by biding his time and waiting to strike. The kill was over, Captain Brahma dead. The assassin looked up from the dead body of the captain, and once again our eyes met. Only this time something flared within his features, and in the next instant he had bounded to his feet, a single lithe jump that took him over the corpse, and he was bearing down upon me. I raised my cutlass, determined not to go easily into the great unknown. And then from the stern, in fact from the magazine, where our men had obviously failed to douse the fire whose fingers had found the stores of gunpowder, came a great explosion. In a thunderclap I was blasted off the deck, describing a circle in the air, and finding a moment of perfect peace, not knowing whether I was alive or dead, whether I still had all of my limbs, and in that moment not caring anyway, not knowing where I'd come to rest, whether I'd slam to the deck of a ship and break my back, or land impaled on a snapped mast, or be tossed into the eye of the magazine inferno, or what I did, which was slap into the sea. Maybe alive, maybe dead, maybe conscious, maybe not. Either way I seemed to drift not far below the surface, watching the sea above. A shifting mottle of blacks, greys, and the flaming orange of burning ships. Past me sank dead bodies, eyes wide open, as though surprised in death. They discoloured the water in which they sank, and trailed guts and stringy sinew like tentacles. I saw a smashed mizzenmast twirling in the water, bodies snared in rigging dragged to the depths. I thought of Caroline, of my father, then of my adventures on the Emperor. I thought about Nassau, where there was only one law, pirate law. And of course I thought about how I had been mentored from privateer to pirate by Edward Thatch. 23. All of this I thought as I sank, eyes open, aware of everything happening around me. The bodies, the wreckage. Aware of it, yet uncaring. As though it was happening to somebody else. Looking back, I know it for what it was, that brief moment, and it was brief, as I sank in the water. I had, in those moments, lost the will to live. After all this expedition, Edward had warned against it. He told me not to go. That Captain Brahma's bad news, he'd said. You mark my words. And he was right. And I was going to pay for my greed and stupidity with my life. And then I found it again, the will to go on. I found it, I grasped it, I shook it. I held it close to my bosom, and from that moment to this I never let it go again. My legs kicked, my arms arrowed, and I streaked towards the surface, breaking the water and gasping for air, and in shock at the carnage around me, watching as the last of the English frigate slipped below the water, still ablaze. All across the ocean were small blazes soon to be doused by the water, floating debris everywhere, and men, of course, survivors. And then, just as I had feared, the sharks started to attack, and the screams began. Screams of terror at first, and then, as the sharks began to investigate more insistently, screams of agony that only intensified as more predators gathered and they began to feed. The screams I'd heard during the battle, agonized as they were nothing compared to the shrieks that tore that soot-filled afternoon apart. I was one of the lucky ones, whose wounds were not enough to attract the sharks' attention, and I swam for shore. At one point I was knocked by a shark gliding past, thankfully too concerned with joining the feeding frenzy to stop. My foot seemed to snag what felt like a fin in the water, and I prayed that whatever blood I was leaking was not enough to tempt the shark away from the more plentiful chum elsewhere. It was a cruel irony that those more heavily wounded were the ones who were attacked first. I say attacked. You know what I mean. They were eaten. Devoured. How many survivors there were from the battle I have no way of knowing. All I can say is that I saw that most survivors ended up as food for the sharks. Me, I swam to the safety of the beach at Cape Buena Vista, and there I collapsed with sheer relief and exhaustion. And if the dry land hadn't been made up entirely of sand, I probably would have kissed it. My hat was gone. My beloved three-pointer which had sat upon my head as man and boy. What I didn't know at the time, of course, was that it was the first step in me shedding the past, saying goodbye to my old life. What's more, I still had my cutlass, and given the choice between losing my hat or my cutlass. And so, after some time thanking my lucky stars, listening out for other survivors but hearing just faint screams in the distance, I rolled onto my back, then heard something to my left. It was a groan, and looking over I saw its source was the robed assassin. He'd come to rest just a short distance away from me, and he was lucky, very lucky, not to be eaten by the sharks, because when he rolled over to his back he left behind a patch of crimson-stained sand. And as he lay there with his chest rising and falling, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps, his hands went to his stomach. His obviously wounded stomach. Was it good for you as well? I asked, laughing. Something about the situation struck me as funny. Even after these few years at sea, there was still something of the Bristol brawler about me who couldn't help but make light of the situation, no matter how dark it seemed. He ignored me, or ignored the quip at least. "Havana," he groaned. "I must get to Havana." That produced another smile from me. "Well, I'll just build us another ship, will I?" "I can pay you," he said through gritted teeth. "Isn't that the sound you pirates like best? 1,000 escudos." That had aroused my interest. "Keep talking. Will you or won't you?" he demanded to know. One of us was badly wounded, and it wasn't me. I stood to look over him, seeing the robes, hidden in which presumably was his blade. I'd liked the look of that blade. I had the feeling that the man in possession of that particular blade might go far, especially in my chosen trade. Let's not forget that before my ship's magazine had exploded, this very man was about to use that very blade on me. You may think me callous. You may think me cruel and ruthless. But please understand, in such situations a man must do what is necessary to survive. And a good lesson to learn if you're standing on the deck of a burning ship, about to move in for the kill. Finish the job. Lesson 2. If you don't manage to finish the job, it's probably best not to expect help from your intended target. And lesson 3. If you ask your intended target for help anyway, probably best not to start getting angry with them. For all those reasons, I ask you not to judge me. I ask you to understand why I gazed down at him so dispassionately. You don't have that gold on you now, do you? He looked back at me, and his eyes blazed briefly, and then in a second, more quickly than I could possibly have anticipated, imagined even, he'd drawn a pocket pistol and shoved it into my stomach. The shock more than the impact of the gun barrel sent me staggering back, only to fall on my behind some feet away. With one hand clutching at his wound, the other with the pistol trained on me, he pulled himself to his feet, Bloody pirates, he snarled through clenched teeth. I saw his finger whiten on the trigger. I heard the hammer on the pistol snap forward and closed my eyes expecting the shot to come. But it never did. And of course it didn't. There was indeed something unearthly about this man. His grace, his speed, his garb, his choice of weaponry. But he was still just a man, and no man can command the sea. Even he couldn't prevent his powder getting wet. Lesson 4. If you're going to ignore lessons 1, 2 and 3, it's probably best not to pull out a gun filled with wet powder. His advantage lost, the killer turned and headed straight for the tree line, one arm still clutching his wounded stomach, and the other warding off undergrowth as he crashed into it and out of sight. For a second I simply sat there, unable to believe my luck. If I was a cat, then I'd have used up at least 3 of my 9 lives, and that was just today. And then without a second thought, well, maybe perhaps a single second thought, because after all I'd seen him in action, and wound or no wound, he was dangerous, I took off in pursuit. He had something I wanted, that hidden blade. I heard him crashing through the jungle ahead of me, so, heedless of the branches whipping my face and dancing over roots underfoot, I gave chase. I reached out to prevent myself being slapped in the face by a thick green leaf the size of a banjo, and saw a bloody handprint on it. Good. I was on the right track. From further ahead came the sound of disturbed birds crashing through the canopy of trees, and I reflected that I hardly needed to worry about losing him. The whole jungle shook to the sound of his clumsy progress. His grace, it seemed, was no more, lost in the blundering fight for survival. "Follow me and I'll kill you," I heard from ahead. I doubted that. As far as I could see, his killing days were over. And so it proved. I reached a clearing where he stood, bent over with the pain of his stomach wound. He'd been trying to decide which route to take, but at the sound of me crashing out of the undergrowth, turned to face me. A slow, painful turn, like an old man crippled with bellyache. Something of his old pride returned, and a little fight crept into his eyes as there was a sliding noise, and from his right sleeve sprouted the blade, which gleamed in the duskiness of the clearing. It struck me that the blade must have inspired fear in his enemies, and that to inspire fear in your enemy was half the battle won. Make someone frightened of you, that was the key. Unfortunately, just as his killing days were over, so too was his ability to inspire dread in his foes. Exhausted and hunched over with pain as he was, his robes, hood, and even the blade looked like the trinkets they were. I took no pleasure in killing him, and possibly he didn't even deserve to die. Our captain had been a cruel, ruthless man, fond of a flogging. So fond, in fact, that he was apt to let the cat out of the bag and administer them himself. And he'd enjoyed doing what he called making a man a governor of his own island, which in other words was marooning him. Nobody but his own mother was going to mourn our captain's passing. To all intents and purposes, the man with the robes had done us a favour. But the man with the robes had been about to kill me as well. And the first lesson was that if you set out to kill someone, you'd better finish the job. He knew that, I'm sure, as he died. Afterwards I rifled through his things. And yes, the body was still warm. And no, I'm not proud of it, but please don't forget I am a pirate. So I rifled through his things. From inside his robes I retrieved a satchel. I thought. Hidden treasure. But when I upended it onto the ground, so the sun could dry the contents, what I saw was, well, not treasure. An odd cube made of crystal, with an opening on one side. An ornament, perhaps. Later I'd find out what it was, of course. Then I'd laugh at myself for ever thinking it a mere ornament. And some maps I laid to one side, as well as a letter with a broken seal that, as I began reading, I realized held the key to everything I wanted from this mysterious killer. Senor Duncan Walpole, I accept your most generous offer, and await your arrival with eagerness. If you truly possess the information we desire, we have the means to reward you handsomely. Though I do not know your face by sight, I believe I can recognize the costume made infamous by your secret order. Therefore, come to Havana in haste, and trust that you shall be welcomed as a brother. It will be a great honor to meet you at last, senor, to put a face to your name and shake your hand as I call you friend. Your support for our secret and most noble cause is warming. Your most humble servant, Governor Laureano Torres y Ayala. I read the letter twice, and a third time for good measure. Governor Torres of Havana, eh? I thought. Rewards you handsomely, eh? A plan had begun to form. I buried Senor Duncan Walpole. I owed him that much at least. He went out of this world the way he'd arrived, naked, because I needed his clothes in order to begin my deception. And though I do say so myself, they were a perfect fit. I looked good in his robes. I looked the part. Acting the part, though, would be another matter entirely. The man I was impersonating? Well, I've already told you of the aura that seemed to surround him. When I secured his hidden blade to my own forearm and tried to eject it as he had, well, it just wasn't happening. I cast my mind back to seeing him do it and tried imitating him. A flick of the wrist. Something special, obviously, to stop the blade engaging by accident. I flicked my wrist. I twisted my arm. I wriggled my fingers, all to no avail. The blade sat stubbornly in its housing. It looked both beautiful and fearsome, but if it wouldn't engage, it was no good to man nor beast. What was I to do? Carry it around and keep trying? Hope I'd eventually chance upon its secret? Somehow I thought not. I had the feeling there was arcane knowledge attached to this blade. Found upon me, it could betray me. With a heavy heart I cast it away, then addressed the graveside I had prepared for my victim. Mr. Walpole, I said, let's collect your reward. 24. I came upon them at Cape Buena Vista Beach the next morning. A schooner anchored in the harbour, boats brought ashore and crates offloaded and dragged onto the beach, where they'd been stacked either by the dejected-looking men who sat on the sand with their hands bound, or perhaps by the bored English soldiers who stood guard over them. As I arrived, a third boat was arriving, more soldiers disembarking and casting their eyes over the prisoners. Why the men were tied up, I wasn't sure. They certainly didn't appear to be pirates. Merchants, by the looks of them. Either way, as another rowing boat approached, I was about to find out. "The Commodore's gone ahead to Kingston," announced one of the soldiers. In common with the others, he wore a tricorn waistcoat, carried a musket. "We are to commandeer this lubber's ship and follow." So that was it. The English wanted their ship. They were as bad as pirates themselves. Merchants like to eat almost as much as they like to drink. Thus they tend towards the stout side. One of the captives, however, was even more florid-faced and plump than his companions. This was the lubber the English were talking about, a man I came to know as Stede Bonnet, and at the sound of the word Kingston he'd seemed to perk up, and he raised his head, which before had been contemplating the sand with the look of a man wondering how he'd got into this position, and how he was going to get out. No, he was saying. Our destination is Havana. I'm just a merchant. Quiet, you bleeding pirate, an irate soldier responded by throwing sand into the wretched man's face. Sir, he cringed, my crew and I have merely anchored to water and resupply. And then, for some reason known only to them, Stede Bonnet's companions chose that moment to make their escape. Or try to make their escape. Hands still tied, they scrambled to their feet and began a lurching run towards the tree line where I hid watching the scene. At the same time, the soldiers, seeing the escape, raised their muskets. Shot began zinging into the trees around me, and I saw one of the merchants fall in a spray of blood and brain matter. Another went down heavily with a scream. Meanwhile, one of the soldiers had placed the muzzle of his rifle at Bonnet's head. Give me one reason I shouldn't vent your skull, he snarled. Poor old Bonnet, accused of being a pirate, about to lose his ship, and now seconds away from a steel ball in the brain. He did the only thing a man in his position could do. He stammered. He spluttered. Possibly even wet himself. And now I drew my cutlass and emerged from the tree line with the sun behind me. The soldier gaped. What I must have looked like as I stepped out of the glare of the sunshine with my robes flowing and cutlass swinging, I don't know, but it was enough to give the rifleman pause. A second in which he hesitated. A second that cost him his life. I slashed upwards, opening his waistcoat and spilling his guts to the sand, spinning around in the same movement and dragging my blade across the throat of another soldier who stood nearby. 2 men dead in the blink of an eye and a third about to join them as I ran him through with my cutlass, and he slid from my blade and died writhing on the beach. I snatched my dagger from my belt with my other hand, jammed it into the eye of a fourth, and he fell back with a shocked yell, blood gushing from the hilt embedded in his face, staining the teeth of his screaming mouth. The soldiers had all loosed their shot at the escaping merchants, and though they weren't slow to reload, there was still no match for a swordsman. That's the thing with soldiers of the Crown. They rely too much on their muskets. Great for frightening native women, not so effective at close quarters with a scrapper who'd learnt his trade in the taverns of Bristol. The next man was still bringing his musket to bear when I dispatched him with 2 decisive strokes. The last of the soldiers was the first to get a second shot off. I heard it part the air by my nose and reacted with shock, hacking at his arm wildly until his musket dropped and he fell to his knees, pleading for his life with a raised hand until I silenced him with the point of my cutlass into his throat. He dropped with a gurgle. His blood flooded the sand around him, and I stood over his body with my shoulders heaving as I caught my breath, hot in my robes, but knowing I had handled myself well. And when Bonnet thanked me, saying, "By God's grace, sir, you saved me. A profusion of thanks," it wasn't Edward Kenway, the farm boy from Bristol, he was thanking. I had started again. I was Duncan Walpole. Stede Bonnet, it turned out, had not only lost his crew, but had no skill for sailing. I had saved him from having his ship commandeered by the English, but to all intents and purposes I had commandeered it myself. We had one thing in common. We were both heading for Havana, and his ship was fast and he was talkative but good company, so we sailed together in what was a mutually beneficial partnership, for the time being at least. As I steered, I asked him about himself. What I found was a rich but fretful man, evidently attracted to more, shall we say, questionable ways of making money. For one thing, he constantly asked about pirates. Most hunt the windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, I told him, suppressing a smile as I steered his schooner. He added, "I shouldn't worry about being waylaid by pirates, truth be told. My ship is small, and I have nothing of immense value. Sugar cane and its yields, molasses, rum, that sort of thing. I laughed, thinking of my own crew. There's not a pirate living who'd turn his back on a keg of rum. Havana was a low port surrounded by forest and tall palm trees, their fronds a lush green that wafted gently in the breeze, waving us in as our schooner sailed into dock. In the busy town, white stone buildings with red slate roofs looked dilapidated and weather-beaten, bleached by the sun and blasted by the wind. We moored, and Bonnet set about his business, the business being helping to maintain amicable links with our former enemies, the Spanish, and doing it using that age-old diplomacy technique, selling them things. He seemed to know the city, so rather than strike out alone, I waited for his diplomacy mission to end, then agreed to accompany him to an inn. As we made our way there, it occurred to me that the old me, the Edward Kenway me, would have been looking forward to reaching the tavern. He'd have been getting thirsty right now. But I had no urge to drink, and I mulled that over as we made our way through Havana, weaving through townsfolk who hurried along the sun-drenched streets, and watched by suspicious old folk who squinted at us from doorways. All I'd done was assume a different name and clothes, but it was as though I'd been given a second chance at becoming, well, a man. As if Edward Kenway was a rehearsal from which I could learn my mistakes, but Duncan Walpole would be the man I'd always wanted to be. We reached the inn, and where the taverns of Edward pasts had been dark places with low ceilings and shadows that leapt and danced on the walls, where men hunched over tankards and spoke from the sides of their mouths, here, beneath the Cuban sun, twinkled an outdoor tavern crowded with sailors who were leathery-faced and sinewy from months at sea, as well as portly merchants, friends of Bonnet, of course, and locals, men and children with handfuls of fruit for sale, women trying to sell themselves. A dirty, drunken deckhand gave me the evil eye as I took a seat while Bonnet disappeared to meet his contact. Perhaps this sailor didn't like the look of me. After the Blaney business, I was used to that kind of thing. Or maybe he was a righteous man and didn't approve of the fact that I'd swiped the ale of a sleeping drunk. "Can I help you, friend?" I said over the lip of my newly acquired beaker. The Jack Tar made a smacking sound with his mouth. "Fancy meeting a taffy deep in Dago country," he slurred. "I'm English myself, biding me time till the next war calls me to service." I curled my lip. "Lucky old King George, eh? Having a piss pot like you flying his flag." That made him spit. "Oi, skulk," he said. The saliva gleamed on his lips as he leaned forward and huffed the sour smell of weak old booze over me. "I've seen your face before, haven't I? You's mates with those pirates down in Nassau, ain't you?" I froze, and my eyes darted to where Bonnet stood with his back to me, then around the rest of the inn. Didn't look like anybody had heard. I ignored the pisshead next to me. He leaned forward, insinuating himself even further into my face. "It is you, isn't it? It is!" His voice had begun to rise. A couple of sailors at a table nearby glanced our way. "It is you, isn't it?" Almost shouting now. I stood, grabbed him, writhing from his seat, and slammed him against a wall. "Shut your gob before I fill it with shot, you hear me?" The sailor looked blearily at me. If he'd heard a word I'd said, he showed no sign. Instead he squinted, focused, and said, "Edward, isn't it?" Shit. The most effective way to silence a blabbermouth Jack Tar in a Havana tavern is a knife across the throat. Other ways include a knee in the groin, and the method I chose, the headbutt. I slammed my forehead into his face, and his next words died on a bed of broken teeth as he slipped to the floor and lay still. "You Bastard! I heard from behind me, and turned to find a second red-faced sailor. I spread out my hands. Hey, I don't want trouble. But it wasn't enough to prevent the right-hander across my face. And next I was trying to peer through a thick crimson curtain of pain shooting across the back of my eyes as two more crewmates arrived. I swung and made contact, and it gave me precious seconds to recover. That Edward Kenway side of me, buried so deep, I exhumed him now. Because wherever you go in the world, whether it's Bristol or Havana, a pub brawl is a pub brawl. They say practice makes perfect, and while I'd never claimed to be perfect, the fighting skills honed during my misspent youth prevailed, and soon the three sailors lay in a groaning heap of arms and legs and broken furniture fit only for kindling. I was still dusting myself off when the cry went up, "Soldiers!" And in the next moment I found myself doing two things. First, running full pelt through the streets of Havana in order to escape the beetroot-faced men with muskets. Second, trying not to get lost. I managed both and later rejoined Bonnet at the tavern, only to discover that not only had the soldiers taken his sugar, but the satchel I'd taken from Duncan Walpole as well. The satchel I was taking to Torres. Shit. The loss of Bonnet's sugar I could live with, but not the satchel. 25. Havana's the kind of place where you can loiter without attracting much attention, and that's on a normal day. On a day they're hanging pirates in the very square the executions are due to take place, then loitering's not only expected, it's bloody well encouraged. The alliance between England and Spain may well have been an uneasy one, but there were certain matters on which both countries agreed, one of them being they both hated pirates. Another one? They both liked to see pirates hanged. So on the scaffold in front of us, three buccaneers stood with their hands tied, staring with wide, frightened eyes through the nooses before them. Not far away was the Spaniard they called El Tiburon, a big man with a beard and dead eyes, a man who never spoke because he couldn't, a mute. I looked from him to the condemned men, then found I couldn't look at them, thinking, there but for the grace of God go I. We weren't here for them anyway. Bonnet and I stood with our backs to a weather-bleached stone wall, looking for all the world as though we were idly watching the world go by and awaiting the execution, and not at all interested in the conversation of the Spanish soldiers gossiping nearby. Oh no, not at all. Are you still keen to look over the cargo we confiscated last night? I hear there were some crates of English sugar. Aye, taken from the Barbadian merchant. Duncan, said Bonnet from the side of his mouth. They're talking about my sugar. I looked down at him and nodded, grateful for the translation. The soldiers went on to discuss last evening's brawl at the tavern. Meanwhile, from the stage, a Spanish officer was announcing the execution of the first man, stating his crimes and ending by intoning, "You are hereby sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead." At his signal, El Tiburon pulled the lever. The trap-door opened, the bodies fell, and the crowd went, ooh. I forced myself to look at the three swinging corpses, finding that I held my breath just in case what I'd been told about the loose bowels was true. Those bodies would be displayed in gibbets around the city. Bonnet and I had already seen such things on our travels. They had little tolerance for pirates here and wanted the world to know it. I was hot in my robes, but right now I was glad of the disguise. We left, our expedition to the scaffold having given us the information we needed. The cargo was in the Castillo. That, then, was where we needed to be. 26. The vast grey stone wall rose way above us. Did it really block out the sun, or was it just an illusion? Either way, we felt cold and lost in its shadow, like two abandoned children. I'll say this for the Cubans, or the Spanish, or whoever you'd say was responsible for building the Grand Castillo de los Tres Reyes del Moro. They knew how to build an intimidating fortress. Around 150 years old, it was built to last, too, and looked as though it would still be there in 150 years' time. I looked from its walls out to sea and pictured it bombarded by the broadsides of a man of war. What impression would the steel balls of mounted guns make, I wondered. Not much. Either way, I didn't have a man of war. I had a sugar merchant. So what I needed was a more covert way of gaining entry. The advantage I had was that nobody in their right mind actually wanted to be on the inside of those dark, brooding walls, for in there was where the Spanish soldiers tortured confessions from their prisoners, and perhaps even performed summary executions. Only a fool would want to go in there, where the sun didn't shine, where nobody could hear you scream. Even so, you couldn't just walk right in. "Oi, mate, you couldn't tell us where the loot room is, could you? I've lost a satchel full of important documents and a weird-looking crystal." Thank God, then, for prostitutes. Not because I was feeling randy, but because I'd seen a way to get inside. Inside the fortress, I mean. Those ladies of the night who sat on a fortune, well, they had good reason to be on the other side of those walls, so who better to get us in? "You need a friend, gringo. You need a woman," said one, sidling up with a flurry of tits, ruby-red lips, and smoky eyes full of promise. I ushered her away from the castle walls. "What's your name?" I asked. "Name, senor." "Do you speak English?" No English." I smiled. "But gold is a language we all speak, no?" Yes, as it turned out, Ruth did speak gold. She was almost fluent in gold, and so was her friend, Jacqueline. Bonnet had been hanging around looking shifty. Introductions were made, and a few minutes later we were walking, bold as brass, to the front gate of the castle. At the top of the approach, I looked back to where the hustle, bustle, and heat of Havana seemed to recede, kept at bay by the forbidding stone and tall watchtowers of the Castillo, which radiated a kind of malignancy, like the mythical monsters sailors said lived in the uncharted depths of the deepest oceans, fat and deadly. Stop it, I told myself. I was giving myself the heebie-jeebies. We had a plan. Now to see if it played out. In the role of burly minder, I banged my fist on the wicket door, and we waited for it to open. Two Spanish soldiers carrying bayoneted muskets stepped outside and gave us the long look up and down, me and Bonnet, with especially lascivious looks reserved for Ruth and Jacqueline. I played my part. I looked tough. Ruth and Jacqueline played their parts. They looked sexy. Bonnet's job was to speak the lingo, some of which I could understand. The rest he filled me in on later. "Hello," he said. "I'm afraid neither of my two lady friends speak Spanish. Thus I've been asked to speak for them, and my colleague here," he indicated me, "he is here to ensure the ladies' safety." Lie. I held my breath, feeling as though there was a sign above our heads advertising our dishonesty. Lie! The two soldiers looked at the girls, who, fortified with gold, not to mention several glasses of rum, preened and pouted so professionally that anybody would think they did it for a living. It wasn't enough to convince the guards, though, who were about to wave us away and let themselves be swallowed up once again by the squatting grey beast, when Bonnet said the magic words, "El Tiburon." The girls had been called for by El Tiburon, the executioner himself, he explained, and the guards paled, sharing a nervous look. We'd seen him at work earlier, of course. It takes no skill whatsoever to pull a lever, but it does require a certain, how shall we say, darkness of character to pull the lever that opens the trap and sends 3 men plummeting to their deaths. So it was that El Tiburon's name alone was enough to inspire fear. With a wink, Bonnet added that El Tiburon liked the girls from Portugal, and Ruth and Jacqueline, continuing to play their parts well, giggled and blew mock kisses and adjusted their bosoms flirtatiously. El Tiburon is the governor's right-hand man, his enforcer, said one of the soldiers suspiciously. What makes you think he will be in the Castillo? I swallowed. My heart nudged up against my ribcage, and I cast Bonnet a sideways look. So much for his information. My dear man, he smiled. Do you really think this assignation would meet the approval of Governor Torres? El Tiburon would need new employment if the governor were to discover him consorting with prostitutes. And as for doing it on the governor's own property... Now Bonnet looked from side to side, and the two soldiers craned to hear more secrets. Bonnet continued. I need hardly say, gentlemen, that being in possession of this information puts you in a most delicate position. On the one hand, you now know things about El Tiburon, Havana's most dangerous man, let's not forget, which he would pay, or perhaps kill. Here he paused just enough to let this information sink in order to protect. Depending on how you want to conduct yourselves in possession of this information, would no doubt dictate the level of El Tiburon's gratitude. Do I make myself clear, gentlemen? To me it sounded as though he was spouting twaddle, but it seemed to have the desired effect on the two sentries, who at last stood aside and let us in. And in we went. The mess hall, said one of the guards, indicating walkways that looked down upon the courtyard in which we now stood. Tell them you're looking for El Tiburon. They'll point you in the right direction. And tell these ladies to behave themselves, lest you inadvertently reveal the true nature of your business here. Bonnet gave his best greasy smile, bowing as we moved past and giving me a sly nod at the same time. We left two thoroughly hoodwinked guards in our wake. I left them to it as I climbed steps, hoping for all the world that I looked like I belonged in the fortress. At least it was quiet. Apart from the sentries, there were very few troops about. Most seemed to have congregated in the mess room. Me? I headed straight for the loot room, where I almost cheered to find the satchel with all the documents and the crystal present and correct. I pocketed it and glanced around. Bloody hell. For a loot room, it was woefully empty of any actual loot. All there was, apart from a pouch containing a few gold coins, which went into my pocket, were crates of Bonnet's sugar. I looked at them. It occurred to me we had no contingency for their rescue. Sorry, Bonnet, it will have to wait for another time. A few minutes later, and I'd rejoined them. They'd decided not to risk the mess room, and instead had been loitering on the walkways, nervously awaiting my return. Bonnet was too relieved to see me back to ask about the sugar. That particular pleasure would have to wait until later. And wiping nervous sweat from his brow, he ushered us back along the passage and down the steps to the courtyard, where our friends the sentries shared a look as we approached. I see. Back so soon. Bonnet shrugged. We asked at the mess hall, but of El Tiburon there was no sign. Possibly there has been some mistake. Perhaps his desires have been satisfied elsewhere. We will tell El Tiburon that you are here, then, said one of the guards. Bonnet nodded approvingly. Yes, please do that, but remember, be discreet. The two guards nodded, and one even tapped the side of his nose. Our secret would be safe with them. Later we stood on the port, with Bonnet's ship nearby. I handed him the bag I'd filched from the loot room at the Castillo. Seemed a decent thing to do, to make up for his lost sugar. I wasn't all bad, you know. Oh, it's no great loss, he said, but took it anyway. Will you stay long? I asked him. For a few weeks, yes. Then back to Barbados, to the tedium of domesticity. But don't settle for tedium, I told him. Sail to Nassau. Live life as you see fit. By now he was